Hey everybody. Today we are talking about reptiles. We have at this point, if you think back, gone through the basics of vertebrates together right before we left school. We then covered fish and amphibians, and now we're going to move on to reptiles, and that only leaves us with then birds and mammals prior to the end of the school year. So we're getting there. So like I said, today we're focusing on reptiles. So still in phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata, and now we're talking class Reptilia. So if you look at the little picture that you've got on your slide here, it's giving you some of the major characteristics of reptiles, specifically their dry skin, having scales. They're typically oviparous, laying eggs, and they are cold-blooded. Something really important that I want to talk about in terms of our properties of reptiles is this is the first situation that we're seeing in our vertebrate animals where they have evolved to no longer be so dependent on water. Not to say that they don't need water. Obviously, all animals need water for survival, but they don't need it in terms of an aquatic habitat. Obviously, our fish were fully aquatic, and then we evolved the amphibians, and those were at least partially aquatic throughout their lifespan, and they were then going through metamorphosis and then becoming terrestrial in a lot of cases. But reptiles are fully terrestrial for the most part. Again, does not mean that some of our reptiles are not going to be aquatic, and we'll talk about that, but they don't have to be. They're not fated to a partially or fully aquatic life. So we mentioned that they were cold-blooded. We're going to use the term ectothermic for that, meaning that they don't internally have control like we do and mammals over their body temperatures. So they are then going to be very dependent on temperature outside, and then different ways that they can help themselves and adaptations with changing their body temperatures in response to that. But they are ectothermic. They are still tetrapods. They have 4 distinct limbs. And I know immediately you guys are thinking, not true, snakes. And we'll talk about that in a little while. But they are still classifying as tetrapods, meaning they have 4 distinct limbs. They have scales, and they respirate exclusively using lungs. Gills are out. We don't have gills, and we also don't have metamorphosis here. They are typically oviparous, meaning egg laying. And again, you're always going to have a couple of exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, we're oviparous. And they are respiring, again, using lungs with no metamorphosis. So then if you look at this next slide, we're talking reptile evolution. So the reptiles are going to be linked back to evolving from amphibians during the Carboniferous period. So again, we think they evolved from amphibians just like amphibians evolved from fish. And these earliest reptiles were referred to as the stem reptiles, and they were super highly adapted for that time and easily outcompeted amphibians, which really allowed them to essentially take over. Amphibians were still around, but in much smaller diversity and numbers, and you were seeing a lot of evolution and change over long periods of time in the reptile communities. And this branched off into 2 major groups, your synapsids and your sauropsids. So sauropsids are what you're going to think of as modern-day reptiles, birds, and they also led to the dinosaurs. Synapsids would then eventually lead to the evolution of mammalian animals. So if you look at the little phylogenetic tree that we've got there for you, you can see in that circled region your reptiles and their connection with dinosaurs and birds, versus the synapsid reptiles being on a very different branch and then eventually leading over to the mammals. So this is going to show you a little bit of that as well. You can see some of the evolutionary linkage and relationships between Sauropsida and Synapsida as your different groups, and then also amphibians on there as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the Mesozoic era before we move on, because I said that the stem reptiles very quickly outcompeted the amphibians and became very diverse and essentially took over, and they dominated the planet during the Mesozoic era. And this was referred to as the Age of Reptiles. Some also call it the Age of Dinosaurs, because this is when dinosaurs ruled the earth. They were the top dog. They were often the top apex predators, and they really out-evolved and out-competed a lot of other organisms. And this all came crashing down during the mass extinction event that essentially changed geologic history, because what it did is it really opened up a door for other types of animals to thrive and other types of organisms to evolve, and that was then the age of the mammals, essentially. So during this mass extinction event, there is a little bit of controversy in terms of what happened. Most will tell you that a meteorite crashed into Earth, and the resulting conditions from that killed off the mass amount of dinosaurs on Earth. Others would say that it was probably due to volcanic action, which had to do with some tectonic plate movements and stuff going on at that time. But either way, we do know that this mass extinction event killed off the majority of these reptilian creatures that we had, and then only a small few survived, and those were the ones that then branched off into the birds, the modern reptiles that we have now, and then the synapsids. So something big about our reptiles is they were the first amniotic organisms. So prior, we talked about fish and amphibians, and they did not have amniotic eggs. Their eggs were very, very simple, and it was essentially just your embryo with a little bit of supporting fluid around it and hope for the best, which is why those eggs were often so dependent upon water for their development and their ability to develop and grow into a full organism. But with my reptilian eggs, for the first time ever, we have additional structures in these eggs that are allowing for them to essentially be laid fairly anywhere. They can be on land, they can be in the water if it needed to be, but they have a lot more probability and likelihood of survival in this case. So our self-contained amniotic eggs, if you look at this photo that I've got for you here, actually have 5 additional structures beyond the embryo that all eggs have. So the first is the amnion, and this is the layer of fluid and membrane that directly encloses the embryo. It's what the embryo is floating in. So if you're thinking human pregnancy, you've probably heard the term amniotic fluid. And it's that protective cushion for the embryo that prevents dehydration, and it also gives some nutrients and things like that to the developing embryo. Then you have the allantois, which is essentially where metabolic wastes are stored during embryonic development to kind of siphon that away from the developing embryo. So if you're thinking placental mammals like us, where there is a placenta that connects the baby to the mother, the wastes from the child are siphoned off and go back to the mother, who then excretes that. Obviously, that's not an option in something that is in an egg. So this kind of serves that purpose. Then you have the yolk sac. If you've ever cracked open a chicken egg and fried it in a skillet, you've noticed there's the egg white, which is all of your other structures like your amnion and things like that. But then you have the yolk, which is that really fatty, rich, yellow blob. And that is actually the fat food supply for your developing embryo. It is this sac surrounding the yolk fat. And that is what the embryo feeds off of essentially during its development. Then you have the chorion, which is the outermost membrane of the egg. It surrounds everything else, and its protection allows oxygen to enter the egg while also removing carbon. If you were to hard boil a chicken egg and gently peel off that shell, oftentimes you get a membranous white layer, and that's your chorion. And then obviously your shell is the mineralized, hard, external, final protective layer that helps protect against the outside environment. So then all of this then leads us to the 4 orders of reptiles. So there is a huge typo on this slide. You'll probably notice it. It says modern fish exist in 4 orders. You're going to change that to say modern reptiles exist in 4 orders. You can see that sometimes I copy and paste my slides to make them all look cohesive. However, 4 major orders of reptiles. The first is order Testudines, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Order Crocodilia, Asphenodontida, and Squamata. So crazy fancy words that essentially break down into turtles, crocodiles, toturas, and then your squamates, which are going to be like your snakes and your lizards. So order Testudines, so comes from the Latin word testudo, which means tortoise. And there are over 300 different species of turtles. Big characteristic of your turtles here is that they do have a bony shell that covers their bodies and protects the soft little bits inside of them. And these shells are connected to internal bones. They are bony extensions of internal bones. The carapace would be the dorsal shell, and the plastron would be the ventral, so on the bottom. That connects to the pectoral girdle versus the carapace, which covers the back, connects to the vertebrae and the ribs. They also have a keratinized beak. Turtles do not have teeth. They instead, we use their little beaks to help crush and tear things like vegetation and leaves. So turtles are actually the most long-lived of our modern reptiles. Reptiles can be very long-lived no matter what the category, but turtles specifically have very long lifespans. They typically reach sexual maturity after 7 to 8 years, and most live upwards of 14 years. Galapagos tortoises can live in excess of 100. So typically the rule of thumb is the larger the turtle, the longer the lifespan. Our oldest current turtle is 152. It is a sea turtle. And there is actually a pet turtle currently alive at the ripe old age of 80 years. Differences between turtles and tortoises. Turtles can be both terrestrial and aquatic, and they have distinct webbing between their toes to aid them in swimming. Tortoises are going to be fully terrestrial. They do not have webbed toes. They do not live in the water. They do not swim. Okay? I know we are all familiar with different sad videos of sea turtles trying to crawl their way back to the ocean, and evil, horrible birds and things trying to get them along their journey. This is pretty straightforward in terms of turtles have a lot of conservation efforts currently going on to protect them, all kinds of turtles, because they have very different reproductive times and strategies compared to some other animals. So when turtles lay eggs, the females will use their hind limbs to dig nests in the soil or sand, depending on what kind of turtle you're looking at, and they'll lay their eggs. They lay anywhere from 5 to 100 eggs in their clutch, depending on the species, and they can hatch in a range of 4 weeks to a year. Again, species dependent. But either way, both eggs and juveniles are fully abandoned. There is no parental care for turtles. So when these eggs are laid, the parents return to the sea or off into the wild, wherever they came from, leaving those eggs there to fend for themselves and to hopefully hatch and grow up. But if you're leaving eggs sit for 4 weeks to a year unattended, other animals have adapted to be able to smell those out, locate those nests, and they will eat them. So that's going to be a big issue. Also, habitat destruction. If you can't find places for turtles to be laying eggs, this can also lead to a decline in population. It's currently estimated that only 1 in 1,000 turtle hatchlings actually survive to reproductive age. So again, that's a very, very small percentage of the eggs actually making it into adulthood. So again, it kind of highlights why there's so many conservation efforts going on. Fun fact about turtles, they're very temperature dependent in terms of gender determination. So it is believed that cooler temperatures will give you male offspring and warmer temperatures will give you female. So now we're going to talk crocodilians. So the crocodilians are the only surviving archosaurian reptiles. Some put the birds in the archosaurian kind of category. We'll talk about birds in a later little mini unit, but crocodiles are the closest dinosaur relatives in the modern reptiles classification. Anatomically, they have not changed very much from their ancient dinosaur ancestors. And there are 4 major types that I want you guys to know: the alligators, crocodiles, caimans, and gavials. So easiest way to tell them apart is to look at their head morphologies, the shape of their heads. Obviously, you can also look at geography because they're from very different parts of the world. But if you were to look at a top-down view, so standing over, looking down at all 4 of these types of crocodilians lined up, you could easily tell them apart. So we're going to go through those anatomical differences right now. So for your crocodiles, they are going to have very triangular sloping heads. So imagine that the head starts where the eyes are and then it slopes downwards. You're also going to see, again, if you're looking from a top-down view, it looking very triangular in its shape, with the nose being much more pointed and slendering out the farther you go. Your alligators are going to have much flatter, wider heads. Differences between crocodiles and alligators also has to do with the teeth. So in crocodiles, you're going to see two sets of visible teeth. Both the upper teeth and the lower teeth are visible when the head is closed, the mouth is closed. In your alligators, when the mouth is closed, you only see the upper teeth, no bottom teeth. So that can be a dead giveaway for you. Caimans look very similar to your alligators, except they are like little shortened, miniaturized versions. I say miniaturized, but they can be like 6 feet long. However, they are not nearly as large as your alligators. They also have a much shortened version of the head where it's not quite as elongated. Also, you can notice that their eyes are much more prominent and do stick up a bit higher than your alligators would. Your gavials are probably the easiest to identify. They are some crazy looking suckers. Male gavials have a giant like nodule at the end of their snout. You can find these in India and in Burma and in like Asian countries. Their snout is extremely elongated. To me, it almost looks like the sword of like a swordfish. It's that type of slender, elongated snout. It is very, very easy to identify. You can also see that their eyes are much more on the sides of the head and almost protrude as their own nodules as well. And then again, between the snout and that nodule on the snout itself in males, they are very easy to identify. So I've given you this picture to kind of practice that top-down view. Again, I've given you a side view as well so you can look at the teeth, but there are some pretty clear indicators between all of them that allow you to identify what you are specifically looking at here. So crocodilians are very predatory. They are very, very aggressive, and they are known for being sneaky hunters. They tend to live in murky waters, and they will hide just under the surface, wait for the prey to come close to the water's edge or into the water, and then use a very explosive forward momentum to grab onto that prey and drag them underwater, where they eventually drown and get eaten. So here are some photos of that for you. So again, you can see the murky waters. You can see the first picture there, the crocodilian kind of waiting very patiently for its prey and then lunging forward. So something else that's really cool about your crocodilians is they have a secondary palate. So if you take your tongue and press it against the roof of your mouth, you can feel your palate, your hard and your soft palate, which separates the mouth from the nose. Crocodiles actually have, and alligators and crocodilians have a secondary palate, which allows them to essentially section off their mouth and nostrils so that they can have a mouthful of prey and water and still be able to breathe just fine. Last thing we're going to talk about here with the crocodilians is, unlike all of our other reptile species as a whole, crocodilians do have parental care. They do show parental care. They almost all do this to some extent, but they are oviparous and they lay their clutches in nests that the mothers will build and guard. In some cases, it's going to be like weeds and leaves and like water grasses and things like that. In other cases, you can see in the photo, they will have debris and twigs, and they will create this nest, and they will stay very close by and guard this for as long as it takes for them to hatch. And then the mothers even remain with the young for 1 to 2 years after that hatching, providing care to them. All reptiles reproduce sexually through internal fertilization. These are no different. Something else, though, interesting about the reproductive strategies is males tend to attract the mates through something called bellowing. It is a type of vocalization, which is like a very deep grunting kind of sound. And it's how they let mates know that they are available. So we're going to move on to Sphenodontida, which is the totoras. And these are going to be the smallest group of reptilians, the smallest reptilian order. There are actually only 2 species left in this order, and you can find all of them in New Zealand. They live nowhere else. So these reptiles are called the tutoras, and they are the only surviving members of a group called the rhynchocephaliates, which again date back to that Mesozoic era, and they've changed pretty little over the last 200 million years. If you look at them from an external point of view, they look very similar to iguanas. They really very much do. However, there are a couple of key changes. One of them being they have 2 sets of upper teeth in their jaws. No other reptiles have that. Something else is they have some other differences in their mouth structures, and all of these together lend itself to a very shearing bite. So they could essentially decapitate their prey very, very easily, which is kind of ironic because they mostly only feed on invertebrates, insects, worms, in some cases small birds or small mammals, but very unlikely for the birds and mammals because they actually live in burrows and nests with seabirds, which is kind of cute. They burrow underground, they are nocturnal, and they hunt dusk and dawn mostly. They have something called a third eye located on top of their head, which senses light intensity changes and helps with their nighttime hunting. They prefer cooler temperatures, and they are fairly low-key little predators here, focusing most of their attention on invertebrates. They're also super rare and super endangered. They are protected under New Zealand law. I mentioned you can only find them in New Zealand. They used to be widely spread throughout all of mainland New Zealand. However, now you can only find them on a couple of remote islands. And even though they are protected, it is illegal to, try and hunt them or anything like that. They have very low reproductive rates and a very high level of predation. So like most other reptiles, they do not use any type of parental care once they lay their eggs. But their eggs are only laid in about a dozen eggs at a time, and they take over a year to hatch. So imagine a very small number of eggs laying in one spot for a very long period of time with no parental guidance, parental care looking after those. They become a really prime target for predators, and that results in a very low reproductive rate for the tutoras, and they are really being outcompeted and dying off in the wild. So last order we're going to talk about is squamata, so snakes and lizards. I was actually super surprised when I first studied this topic to find that lizards and snakes were in the same order. I guess I naturally kind of assumed that they would be different, but they are together, and the main reason has to do with their flexible skeletons and their skulls. So they have something called kinetic skulls, and it means that they can separate their skulls and move their jaw and skull pieces around in a way that allows them to swallow very, very large prey compared to the size of their head. And then again, we're going to break those into 2 orders, the saurians and the serpents. So starting with our saurians, over 4,000 different species. They are the more typical reptiles. They have the 4 legs. They look like your most traditional tetrapods in terms of reptilian tetrapods, and their upper and lower jaws unite anteriorly. The lizards are going to be really highly diverse, all kinds of different types of reproductive strategies, whether it's being oviparous, oviviparous, viviparous, anything like that. Also, their locations are super, super varied. Habitats, super, super varied. I've given you a couple of different big groups of saurians here, but again, there are others. If you're like me, the first thing you looked at was that crazy little guy on the right. That is the amphisbaenians, and they are called worm lizards. They are legless for the most part. You can see they have some vestigial legs up at the top that are too small to even really touch the ground. So they really serve no purpose. They look very worm-like. They are burrowing, and I had never really even seen, I think, one of those until I put this together. I've also showed you chameleons, iguanas, geckos. Chameleons are a type of an iguana. They're arboreal, meaning they live in the trees. They have super sticky long tongues, and as all of you are familiar with, they do change color in response to the environment. Your iguanas can be identified based on their body shapes and sizes, essentially. They're very, very thick and stocky. They have very short, almost non-existent necks, and a very distinct head shape. They look very dinosaur-like to a lot of people, me included, where you can see the nostrils at the end, and they look kind of creepy and a little bit scary, but they have a very distinct look about them, and that's how you would identify them. Your geckos are the ones that tend to look the most closely related to amphibians. Not to mean that they are, but they look a lot more like things like salamanders. However, they do have scales, and they are nocturnal, and they have little adhesive digits which allow them to climb very, very easily. So let's talk about serpents. So there are over 9,000 species of snakes. They are the most highly diverse of all of our groups of reptiles. But of these 9,000, only 300 of them are actually venomous. Again, a lot of us think of snakes and we immediately think like, oh no, poison, stay away. Only 300 of 9,000 are venomous or dangerous to you in that way. But of those 300 species, they do account for 30,000 human deaths per year. So their venom, a lot of times, is nothing to play with. So they are characterized by their elongated limbless bodies. So something I like to point out every year with this is, yes, they are limbless. But yes, they still count as tetrapods. And you might be thinking, how can that be if tetrapod means they have 4 distinct limbs? They are considered tetrapods because of their evolutionary linkage to other tetrapod organisms. But in some cases, so thinking boa constrictors and pythons, they actually have vestigial hind limb bones buried essentially in their muscle tissue towards the tail, left over from evolutionary links to having legs. Again, they're vestigial structures. They don't do them any good and they're not useful, but they actually do still have hind limb bones in some of these snakes. So because of that, we still classify them as tetrapods. Snakes are super, super flexible. They have joints between their vertebrae where you and I don't, right? So I couldn't bend my back in crazy ways because it's cartilage and connective tissue between the vertebrae that's not meant to be moved. But in the case of our serpents, they actually have movable joints between all of these vertebrae. Also, their internal organs are displaced. So they are going to be spread out throughout this skinny, elongated body in different layouts than what you would see in a traditional reptile in order to allow for this super, super flexible body. Again, the skulls are kinetic and they're highly adapted for swallowing large prey whole. So they can actually dislocate the jaw that's not really connected, but they can open this jaw up to where they can then swallow things way, way bigger than what they should be able to. So most snakes are oviparous. Vipers, boas, cobras, they actually do all give birth to live young. So in that case, those eggs would hatch internally and then the live birth there. While pit vipers are the only snake known to actually care for their young, and they do this through something called egg brooding, which I've shown you a picture of. Egg brooding is essentially hoarding your eggs and caring for them while they're still in egg form. Last little bit we're going to talk about is the movement of snakes. So if I were to tell you to picture a snake moving, most of you picture this S-shaped slithering, and that's the first major type of snake movement, but there are actually 3. So that first slithering that you're probably thinking of is called lateral undulation, and that is S-shaped. And the muscles contract and allow the snake to move from one side to the next, the head moving side to side, causing this S-shaped movement. The second is rectilinear movement. And so this is what I like to call the inchworm or the caterpillar movement. So imagine putting your arm on a table and then trying to do the worm with it. Okay, you're doing the wave. That is rectilinear movement. So where a piece of the body pops up due to muscle contraction and then flattens back out, and with every one of those movements, the body is slowly moved forward. Last one is sidewinding. You might have seen this in videos of like the desert. You're going to see this in a lot of sandy conditions. This is where certain types of snakes will very vigorously and what looks to be aggressively fling their head to the side, which causes the whole body to move in a whip-like motion at a diagonal. And it causes it to be able to move pretty large distances in a fairly short amount of time, especially in an area like a sandy desert that it's hard for them to do their traditional movements through because of things like friction. And that brings us to the end of reptiles, my friends. If you have questions, let me know. But otherwise, I'll talk to you guys later.